There's a few things I've learned about myself as a parent that I didn't know or realize ahead of time. And the first time I thought, oh great, I'm going to be one of those parents, was when I left Isabel to go to church by myself at my previous appointment. She was 3 months old, and I'd returned from maternity leave, but I was still taking her with me to the church office each day. And then, of course, Sunday morning for worship. But there was something that happened, I don't remember what it was, where it wouldn't have worked out really well at all for me to bring her with me. And so my mom kept her for the day. And as I drove away from the house, I was bawling. And my thought was, all right, I'm going to be one of those parents who cries when they leave their children. Didn't expect that. Apparently, I'm one of those parents. And apparently I've learned that I'm also one of those parents who buys books on parenting to read and for encouragement and inspiration and ideas of how to be a better parent. The last one I picked up a little bit ago was this one called Unselfie: Why Empathetic Kids Succeed in Our All-About-Me World. The author, Michelle Borba, is an educational psychologist who's often called in as a child expert or a parenting expert on shows like Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil and news shows. And she begins by talking about how today's teenagers are 40% less empathetic than those of 30 years ago. And then combining it with a culture of self-absorption and all about me, and the example that she gives of the selfie, where we take our own pictures now, it can create a population of kids who don't relate well to others. And working well with others and cooperating, as we all know, is key to being a contributing member of society as an adult. Now, our gospel lesson this morning is a story that Jesus tells to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous. And they looked down on everyone else with contempt. This is a group that's self-righteous, who has justified everything that they do in their own eyes, who can't do any wrong as far as they're concerned. And then more than that, they look down on everyone else. It's the I'm right and you're wrong, or my way or the highway, or just people who think they're better than everyone else. And to them, Jesus tells this parable about the two people praying, the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee prays loudly and prays about himself so that everyone can hear him and knows the good things he's done. It's kind of like a little passive-aggressive way to brag, right? You don't directly tell people all the good stuff you've done. You tell God and make sure everyone else can overhear you. And then there's the tax collector. And he stands by himself apart, doesn't even look up to heaven. And he's probably half mumbling, half whispering the words, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus says that the tax collector and not the Pharisee was the one who went home right with God. And I started to think that the Pharisee might be a good example of the self-absorption and selfie culture that we live in. Focus on me, look at all the good things I've done or am doing. Yet the more I read this book about teaching kids empathy in order to combat that selfish, that focus on me nature, the more empathy I felt toward the Pharisee. Why was he praying? So that everyone could hear him. Why was he boasting about his good works? Why did he feel he had to point out to God that he was better than other people, or at least committed more minor sins than other people? Did he not get enough validation of his good works at home? Or did people not thank him enough for his charitable contributions? Did he think God didn't notice what he was doing? Did he just want someone to notice him, someone to pay attention, even if it was negative attention? Did he just want someone to listen? At church conference this past week, our district superintendent, Reverend DeLong, talked about listening and how a lot of people just want someone to listen to them. They don't want someone to fix their problems. They want someone to listen to their problems. When we're absorbed in ourselves and our own problems, we don't spend a lot of time and energy listening to others' problems. When we're focused on ourselves, we're not listening to each other. Who listens to you? Is it a spouse? Do you have a friend? I put down as a question, tongue-in-cheek, a bartender. Who listens to you? And when was the last time you felt really listened to? And how do you try to be heard? Because the Pharisee obviously went about it in the wrong way. He didn't sit down with coffee over his rabbi or call up a good friend. He didn't tell his wife. Instead, he's out there in the public square where everyone can hear him, and he wants everyone to hear him. He wants some public affirmation that he's a good person. He wants someone to listen to him. And so we hear his story. He thinks he's not like everyone else. He thinks he's exceptional. He'd probably be the first to say he's not perfect, but he's not as bad as other people. He doesn't have a criminal record. He's not a thief. He doesn't cheat on his wife. He regularly fasts and tithes. He thinks he does pretty good, and he wants someone to notice and appreciate it. He's a good Pharisee. And yet, that doesn't make him right with God. It's really tempting to start judging the Pharisee. Pharisees were the group of Jews that were very strict about keeping to the letter of the law exactly. And it's easy to point out that the law doesn't only say don't cheat on your wife, but also says to love and honor her. Or the Ten Commandments do say don't steal, but they also say don't covet and don't want what's not yours. It's pretty easy to pick apart what's wrong with this picture, and yet there he is, praying loudly in front of the temple, wanting to be heard. So today, instead of sitting on judgment on him, let's take a minute and validate and affirm what he does right. And let's start with the spiritual disciplines. Pharisees were a very disciplined sect. They were excellent at self-control, which is one of the fruits of the Spirit, by the way, if you look up Galatians 5. And you have to be self-disciplined in order to do something like fast. You have to be able to control your impulses and wait for delayed gratification when you go all day without eating on purpose. That really is impressive. And the other spiritual discipline that the Pharisee tells everyone about is that he tithes. He gives 10%. Again, generosity is another one of the fruits of the Spirit. He gives away 1/10 of everything he receives. Not many of us Christians even do that. Personally, I've always thought this, even before I became a pastor. I think the church would be in much better shape if everyone was generous and self-disciplined with their time and talent and treasure. But generosity and self-control and all spiritual disciplines have to be cultivated and nurtured and practiced. And the Pharisee does that. He spends his time and his energy on things that are supposed to draw him closer to God. That's always to be commended. Yet he seems to be looking for public affirmation and approval, and that's not how spiritual disciplines work. Many spiritual disciplines, no one knows you're doing them. They just see the side effects of a person who's freer with their love and with their belongings. You see, I think the Pharisee's doing the right things, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. I think he may have gotten so caught up in following the law of Moses so precisely that he's missing the spirit of the law, which involves care for the widow and the orphan and the outcast. He's missing the love, and so he's looking for it in the public square. He's crying out for someone to hear him, for someone to validate and affirm that yes, what he's doing is right. Yet he's doing it by exalting himself and belittling others. I thank you, God, that I'm not like everyone else. What kind of prayer is that? He wants everyone to know that he thinks he's exceptional and his sins aren't as bad as others. Now, the Catholic Church has a hierarchy of sins. You probably have heard at some point in time about the mortal sins, which, let's see, I looked it up. They will condemn you to hell if they stay unforgiven. That's the mortal sin in the Catholic Church. And then there's the venial sins, or the lesser ones, which hurt your relationship with God but can't break it. Catholic doctrine. However, the Bible, the book of Romans, says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't say that some fall less short than others. It doesn't say that there's a way to not be under judgment, which I think is what the Pharisee is after. I think he wants his good works and keeping God's law to save him. And yet that's not how it works. None of us are exceptional. None of us are exempt from judgment. So after you've listened to someone like the Pharisee, after you've really heard them, and that judgment comes from the other person, that does not, when you feel like you've heard them, it's when that person feels like they've been listened to. Then you can respond, as appropriate. They may need a hug. They may need cheering up. They may need reassurance that they are, in fact, doing everything right. Jesus said the tax collector and not the Pharisee was in the right with God when he went home. So what did the Pharisee need when he went home? How could the Pharisee make himself right with God? Jesus tells the parable basically to tell us to be like the tax collector and not like the Pharisee. But I think we all know people like the Pharisee, if not even identify with him ourselves sometimes. Jesus wouldn't have to tell us to be like the tax collector if we weren't already more like the Pharisee. Was the Pharisee's sin that he was proud? Did he have self-esteem issues? Did he just need someone to listen to him? Someone not to sympathize, but to empathize with him. Sympathy is feeling for another person, but empathy is feeling with them. There's another book I'm reading currently, not a parenting one. This one's called It's Not Fair by Melanie Dale. And she has a whole chapter on 100 things you can do to help someone who's hurting when life isn't fair. A lot of times we say or we do the wrong thing, or we think we've listened but our friend doesn't feel listened to, or we say or do something stupid, or we haven't said or done anything at all because we don't know what to say or do. What do you say after you've heard the Pharisee's public confession? If you were his friend, how would you respond to him after that? He thinks he's better than everyone else. And unless he thinks you're exceptional too, he might not even be willing to listen to you. So over the next couple weeks, I'm going to be sharing some of the ideas that Melanie Dale has listed in her book of ways to help others, ways to show God's love for him. That may just be some food for thought of how do you need to feel listened to this week, and how can you make it a point to listen to others. Let us pray.